Hello. I'm an architect and I make sculpture. And I want to share with you today what I think I can call a vision for making in the environment, contributing. And I must say that some of the things I'm going to say I feel a bit shy about. I hope I can speak a bit personally with you. When I was little, I stood and I sat on the shoulders of my father, and I was carried by my mother. And I remember the unspeakably delicious sense of being carried, as if the world will always be with me, as if this will be my home, as if I can lean and be carried and feel that my world is eternal. As a young man, I stand on the ice-scoured ground of our country, and I think I've had that sense too, of the world being certain, of nature always being strong with me, as if nature would be eternal. And what of the ground that we speak on today? Trembling. Unspeakably insecure. As if nature has changed forever. As if we are somehow tumbling as a planet. How is it possible, as a maker, as an architect, to be confident in making for this world, in contributing to this world? I think that if I were a young designer today, then I would make very tight jackets. At least I would understand if someone felt that way. I would try to limit myself and try to make the tightest possible shells, perhaps seek a kind of no-trace camping. The clearest possible boundaries, limiting what I do. And yet, what possible contribution to this world comes from making the tightest possible, closed possible things around us? I hope that we might be able to share visions of the world in which we build and feel the multiple octaves, the myriad of ways that we are open and interrelated. And I hope that we might be able to build a kind of collective sense in which we create fertility and share. I hope that I can justify that kind of confidence by sharing some very particular craft with you that changes the way we make things. I used to work with bricks and mortar and very, very solid and very clear things. But the way I've been working now, learning from many partners, I'm now part of a partnership called the Living Architecture Systems Group with about 70 people around the world, over 20 countries working together. And we have a rather special way of working. We start with ordinary buildings. And inside those spaces, perhaps a bit like a petri dish has a very special culture in it, we hang and suspend and weave very, very delicate things, deliberately fragile, trying to find ways for things to build and become fertile and renew themselves and become literally alive. Learning from those things, from those delicate, dependent things, we then make jackets around buildings, solar-responsive envelopes, self-renewing ivies that start to make new skins around buildings, that refresh the environment, that collect carbon, that set out new material that can grow itself. And we hope that learning from this, that we can start to build the ground as well, making self-spinning geotextiles that are renewing, that are growth matrices, that will truly make things fertile, and we hope even more that we'll be able to address the air and the many ripples of warmth and exchange in chemistry that constitute our entire world, changing architecture into a design space that might be thought of as a kind of a soil, our fertility, a renewal. Let me show you some images of the kinds of things that we're making that I hope will justify that kind of vision. Some of the work appears like a great, gentle swamp full of multiple hyperbolic arches and basket-like columns, deeply clothed with mechanisms that had arrays of microprocessors that run through them, making artificial intelligence that sends ripples of response all the way through the environments. In some of these installations, we've been rather confident, such as the Venice Biennale for Architecture, where we set up a kind of a symphony of multiple layers, hyperbolic vaults above us, basket-like columns, hundreds of microprocessors and sensors that set up arrays of artificial intelligence, hanging filters that passed air through very gently, many, many small implants of chemistry too, protocells, prototype cells, serving to generate new carbon-captured material, refreshing the air. When we went in that kind of environment, at first, things were very still. And then, as you move through it, the multiple arrays of sensors start to detect your movement and start to offer blooms of light and tiny trickles of vibration and sensation and tiny whispers of sound too that start to move and chorus, following you, echoing you, making conversations with you, quite literally being curious about you and offering empathetically a kind of conversation in which the environment almost literally becomes alive. Not alive as someone that's trying to do your bidding, not alive as something that makes you feel powerful, but rather the much more delicate sense of exchange. Surrounded by that environment, there are many, many mechanisms that gently stir air and that send out ripples of response all the way through, following you and tracing you. Let me look a little bit closer at the kinds of things we've been making. I hope that you can see in this image the kind of quite robust, interwoven scaffold. This is made by carefully digitally addressed material, thermoplastics, which are carefully drawn and then drawn out into these hyperbolic forms and then woven through with the cable works of the multiple microprocessors and then filled again with the chemistry that starts to be self-renewing. This new fertile-like turf which replaces the bricks and mortar of a previous architecture. The material is deeply resilient, and it has sensors through it that impart movement that allow very, very gentle movements back, rippling, breathing, fostering an exchange. There start to be individual movements using very special mechanisms, shape memory alloys, that silently contract and ripple and move large scales of things that start to ripple out and make great rolling waves around you, turbulent waves. This delicious sense of not being alone in a building, but rather having conversations directly with the environment. And interwoven also in those fabrics are chemical systems, protocells, prototype cells that have small bits of chemistry woven into them that capture carbon and send out new veils of material that start to renew themselves. This work has acquired a number of different scales, and I've been describing large environments, but it has also moved into clothing as well, a really lovely collaboration with Iris van Herpen, where now 10 collections have been generated. A new vision of clothing as architecture in which possibility shells rippling around our bodies are enacted, and rather carefully addressed fabrics as well, such as these deeply laser-cut, oscillating fabrics that shimmer and work around your body. Just to show a little bit more of these kind of environments, here's one from Seoul, where I hope that you can see the multiple strata of individually thermally formed elements which weave together into these basket-like constructions and then are interwoven with the chemistry and the microprocessing. Standing back from this environment also is tremendous darkness, projecting to the edges of our perception the sense that rather than foregrounding the kind of certainty of territory, trying to make walls and boundaries, there's a delicious sense of openness working right at the very edges of our perception, flickering. Can I see it? Did I imagine it? A kind of lovely sense of possibility. A very personal kind of detailing is a fundamental building block for this architecture of setting up individual tentacles and individual elements which are organized robotically, touching and touching back. And in that environment, there are many, many of these mechanisms making a rather thick, fertile textile that ripples out and moves together. And there's a number of very specialized crafts that make this possible. One of them is Schlieren photography. I love that word, Schlieren. Do you want to say it with me? Schlieren. You didn't say Schlieren, please. Schlieren. Schlieren photography looks very carefully at the differential of thermodynamics that work around your body. And it allows us to see that instead of acting in a void, that there are convective plumes that move around us, and that we're deeply, deeply interwoven in the world. And this translates into a very particular way of making things, of trying to make things as delicate as possible, as trying to make things resonant and responsive. Perhaps the opposite of strength, perhaps the opposite of clarity. When we make this kind of material, the kinds of things we're trying to do are seeking the most possible precarious point where it's impossible for something to stay stable. And then we amplify, and using mechanisms, we try to make things that are deeply, deeply responsive, unapologetically fragile. Supporting that kind of detailing is a geometry as well. The geometry that allows us to see how things are coupled and interrelated in the world. This is a beautiful slide. It's a slide of quasi-geostrophic turbulence. Please say it with me. Geostrophic meaning turning, the turning of the world. Quasi meaning that exquisitely unstable, wavering butterfly wing kind of motion in which something flutters and arises. This is open source software. It's available to any designer today, and it allows us, with the same kind of knowledge that allows us with exquisite precision to predict the weather, to understand how we are inextricably bound up in the continuum of so many dimensions. And this translates into practical geometry. Here's another quasi-periodic geometry. Say it again, please. Quasi-periodic. Rather than making things as stable and crystalline and orderly as possible, we use quasi-periodic geometry to have multiple different vectors in which as many possible different strands can cross each other and create a great web of resilience, taking on any vector at all, rather than the kind of crystalline, homogeneous making where cracks can happen, where unified failure happens. And this craft, in turn, is supported by quite careful detailing, drawing things patiently, harvesting the resilience of material using snap-fit technology that allows individual joints to join together without adhesives, anticipating that by addressing tiny things and then multiplying them by hundreds of thousands of times, literally in each environment, it becomes possible to make hyperbolic vaults and scaffolds and great textile environments that are capable of handling tremendous amounts of turbulent force. These then, in turn, are clothed by chemistry, such as the protocells that I'm showing you right now. And just to get a sense of the dynamics that happen within each of these protocells, here's an image where you can see the individual chemicals working together. This is a copper sulfate crystal with potassium ferric cyanide, a very simple inorganic solution around it. And those two things interact, blooming, osmotically pumping to make these kind of self-renewing skins. It's a lucky thing that they're inside glass chambers right now because they make sticky messes. But with more development, we're very hopeful that this kind of process, this protocell process, embedded as a metabolism inside buildings, might work a bit like the self-renewing ivy of seasonal changing clothing buildings. Underlying this process also is a kind of artificial intelligence and curiosity that continually searches out the human occupant and engenders conversations, feeling, curiously trying on, empathetically responding. And if we take these kinds of details, then I think that I can say that there are some fundamental ways of making design that underlie them. As a young person, I was taught that things start with order, and then they fall apart. Shakespeare told me that. My destiny is dust. I wonder if that's something that we share. I'm quoting the second law of thermodynamics, perhaps, the idea that entropy increases and that entropy means disorder. What a terrible thing to say about the world. The sense that somehow the further and further we go, the more and more disappointed we would become. New physics tells us something very different about entropy. Rather than disorder, we get an extraordinary sense that standing in between order and disorder, things last. The world of dissipative forms, the kind of ripples at the edge of a beach, perhaps, or the barred cumulus clouds that make up fundamentally the world of natural things under the drive of the sun and the turning of the planet. This sense that instead of things decaying, that things can last, and in fact, that life can make the maximum possible entropy, invites us to have a fundamental kind of change about how we feel about the world. Entropy needs to be changed as well, because it needs to be understood not as decay and disorder, but rather maximum potential, the maximum degrees of freedom. And what that allows is a sense that the greatest possible interaction with the world and the greatest possible involvement becomes something that we can contribute. There's a form language that goes with this kind of design. And it's a form language that is very different than the one that I've personally been taught as a young person. I think I was taught that something like a sphere was the perfect form, the ideal kind of thing, that it was good to make clear boundaries, to make things as rigid and clear and crisp as possible. I wonder if you can look at this kind of form and see, as I think I do now, something ugly. Are you with me? Can you hate this raindrop? I think I do hate this raindrop. I hate it because in the equations of this form language is an inexorable sense that the maximum possible enclosed territory and the minimum possible surroundings is absolutely inevitable, that it's good to exclude, that it's good to have as much inside you, that it's good to have the rigidest possible boundary. It treats the outside as somehow an emptiness. It's an architecture of death. I wonder, you didn't laugh at all when I said the architecture of death, but I mean it. This is an ugly raindrop. Why would it not be possible for the same material to exfoliate and have the maximum possible reticulation and the greatest possible vulnerability? Why do we habitually think that such a form as a snowflake is somehow frilly, excessive, good only for peacetime? Why indeed might we not think of form languages much like this little creature, an amoeba, in which multiple granular forms are all together, and the boundaries are as much pulled into their surroundings as pushing and foraging. Would it not be possible then to think of boundaries as being open, and of many, many delicate things to be an extraordinarily effective way to make our world? This relates fundamentally to a way of making architecture, and the older world, the world of the solid ground, is still with us. Perhaps it's embodied in the term firmitas, the Vitruvian writer who spoke of this 2,000 years ago and said that permanence and closure and clarity are the fundaments of architecture. But what I want to share is that a new set of paradigms might be possible too. Paradigms that are founded on the making of life, on compartments and resilient organizations and information and metabolism. Architecture that might be designed in very much the same way that we make living things. I want to share a question then, in closing. If it is possible to understand that the world is something in which we are inexorably coupled, and in which making delicate things, unapologetically fragile things, can serve life, can create fertility, can be effective, then why, if I encounter the kind of opening of boundaries that I see in this kind of world, of this little creature emptying itself, dying, if it is true that it's coupled with its environment, then why, if that is what's happening to me, would I not feel joy? Is it possible to be confident standing on this trembling surface of the world today in making substantial things and creating fertility and building responsibly? It's not possible to be confident. But I do hope that by sharing these kinds of strategies, that a kind of hope can be justified. And I hope that's a contribution. Thank you.